Welcome to the Strong Starts podcast with your hosts, Jessica Whitehead and Sarah Gerber-Kai.
Welcome back, everybody. There's been a bit of a through line, especially with our most recent episodes, trying to shift us away from a compliance-based model for education and towards other frameworks that are more trauma responsive, more based in connection. And we're going to add a little bit to that conversation today by discussing neuroaffirming models of practice. What does neuroaffirming practice mean? What does this look like in our day-to-day in education, especially when we're thinking about building systems? And this is a neuroaffirming practice in general is a movement that started in like the late 80s, early 90s with neurodiversity, the neurodiversity movement. And so we're really going to be pulling from a lot of things that already exist. This isn't something we're kind of co-creating here today, Jessica, but we want to talk specifically about what this looks like in schools. So Jessica, I thought you could start us off. Could you tell us a little bit about maybe how neuroaffirming practice has shown up in your work, what it looks like, and kind of how you're applying some of these principles?
We are seeing more students who are neurodivergent in our classrooms, in our schools, in our buildings. And that word is just popping up more in our conversations when we talk to parents, when we're sitting in meetings. And we see some, I guess we call it the obvious signs of neurodivergence. But then when we talk about students who that may not be as obvious to other staff, it seems like we're having a harder time, I guess, responding to that. So let me give an example to kind of put this in perspective for you. If we have a student who maybe has an IEP for a learning disability, an academic need, and so they get SDI in reading, maybe math and writing. And when you look at the evaluation, there's some indicators that executive functioning might also be a factor. So maybe there's low processing speed, maybe there's organizational difficulties, and maybe on top of that, there's some sensory needs. But the student is in the general education classroom most of the day. So you have a 7-hour school day, and maybe the student receives 30 minutes to an hour of pullout a day because the team has decided that they can access the general education curriculum in the classroom. But, after a little while, we're seeing some problem behaviors pop up. So then we're saying, does the student need some sort of behavior plan? Should we have assessed for behavior? Should we have done an FBA? And when the work gets really hard, the student is maybe swiping papers off the table, maybe tearing up the work. We see the head down, those behaviors that we group into the category of refusal. Maybe even when there's a lot of language happening, there's a lot of stuff happening on the playground. We see some physical aggression, maybe some pushing kids away, maybe some punching students. And when we really dig into what's happening with a student, we have to start asking some questions, right? Is the student receiving too much information at one time? If their processing speed is low, have we looked into that as being a factor? Have we cut down the amount of assignments? Have we helped that student communicate and advocate for the needs? So a lot of times when we see this problem behavior pop up, we need to, it's our duty to really dig into all these factors that could be playing a role in that problem behavior.
Well, and you brought up a few things that I want us to kind of tease out a little bit. So one of the things you brought up is the barriers for the adults in terms of, I guess, identifying or at least naming that there is a struggle happening, some kind of challenge happening in the interaction between myself as the adult and the student, and then how I'm assessing and framing that challenge and then responding to it in a neuroaffirming way. And so when I think about some of those adult barriers, one of the things that comes up for me is this idea of, and you talked about this too, of the invisible disabilities and kind of a challenge I think that some of us have, maybe many of us have, with not just recognizing that, but then empathizing, coming to the table when we're talking about shaping behavior with a sense of empathy for folks who are neurodivergent, who have these brain-based differences, as opposed to coming to the table with, hey, they need to stop this behavior. This isn't acceptable. This isn't working out for them, and it's affecting the other kids in the class. And so how do you respond when you're working with the adults? How do we create that understanding?
Well, there's so much in play here because we think of who has access to the IEP, first of all. So if a student goes to a reading group, because students on IEPs can still go to tiered intervention groups. And if they're going to a tiered intervention group, does that person, maybe it's a paraprofessional, maybe it's another certificated teacher, do they have access to the student's IEP and understand their needs and accommodations? Also, as an IEP team, when that team has received the evaluation results, sometimes things like executive functioning skills or processing speed aren't always noted clearly in an IEP because students don't tend to get SDI for processing speed, right? So it's not usually clear like, oh, they're getting 30 minutes for processing. So sometimes that's tied into speech language. Sometimes it's depending on the kid, right? It could be under accommodations, whatever. But is the team around the table looking at the student's IEP, if they have one? Maybe they don't even have an IEP, right?
Mm-hmm.
But are they looking at this and saying, how can we communicate the student's needs beyond their goals, right? So they have a reading goal, they have a math goal, they might even have like a social emotional goal. But other factors that we consider when we do these evaluations, how are those being communicated to everyone who interacts with the student? So you think if the student is on the playground and they're getting a whole set of directions, staff members talking to them, a kid is yelling at them, and they're trying to process all of this information, and we know their processing is low, right? Maybe their, receptive language is low. So how do the people who interact, the adults that are out there, how do they know how to help this student? Have they had access to the IEP? Has someone touched base with them about those needs? And so when we talk about the adults and we're talking about the IEP team or the support team for the student, a lot of times we look at the gen ed teacher, the special education staff. Sometimes we talk about maybe there's a behavior interventionist or the principal. But there's so many adults that come in contact with that student in a day. We think of like cafeteria. How are we communicating and helping that student be successful throughout the whole entire 7-hour day? And for some students, maybe we're even giving them an intervention on how to advocate for themselves appropriately, depending on their age and developmental level. So there's so many factors that need to be looked at before we sit there and say the kid has a behavior problem.
100%. And I think that's a great place to start in terms of communicating with the adults. But I'm going to push on it a little bit because I've heard you speak differently to this. So I'm going to kind of pull that out of you a bit, which is this idea of we don't need to actually know before we can just presume need and set up the environment that way. So I think it's a great way. I think it's a great place for us to start because I think that there, just like our, students have different needs and like skills and talents and strengths and everything like that. So do our adults. So for some of our adults, it might be harder to remember all the different needs and ways to respond if we haven't explicitly stated them. But as we move systems and build staff capacity, one of the things that we can consider is, hey, how are we just setting up our staff and setting up our school environments to just presume that the need exists and meet the need regardless of what a piece of paper says? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I do, because in an ideal world, we're just using those practices anyway. So it doesn't always happen is the issue. So a lot of times we don't have the empathy until after we've presented the problem to the staff or we've presented the reason for the empathy to staff. And that's a very difficult shift. So I think when we're talking about a student-specific plan and staff are saying the student has these problem behaviors, what can we do about it? And we need to put in a behavior plan for this student. My pushback is, yes, I see those behaviors. However, are we considering all the needs of the student? But in an ideal world, an ideal education setting, we are already doing these trauma-informed practices. We should not be on a playground drilling a kid with these long paragraphs about their behavior. Doesn't matter the age or developmental level. If a kid, what we know about dysregulation and co-regulation is when somebody is getting to that point where they're having that problem behavior, they're not regulated. So don't talk to them in paragraphs. They're not going to hear that. It doesn't matter if they have a disability or don't have a disability. So hopefully we're educating staff on these practices that they should be using anyway with any student.
Sort of a tangent, but there's a really great show that I've been watching. It's a medical drama on HBO called The Pit. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. But because a lot of these like models and movements kind of start in the medical field anyway, they touch on the neuroaffirming care. In one particular episode, a patient comes into the ER and is like what a doctor might call non-compliant, not answering the questions, not helping them like move forward with a treatment plan. And another doctor who's on the show, her sister's autistic, notices some of the signs of neurodivergence right away. And so she takes over, she enters the room, turns off the lights, blocks out some of the sound, turns off some of the alarms, and then just starts following the patient's thought process instead of like demanding that they answer in this particular way to get the patient history. And everything completely changes. And so if you haven't seen it, it's a great example of how to just approach a situation in a neuroaffirming way from the get-go, as opposed to trying to because any other ER, that patient would have been non-compliant and just maybe shuffled out. But you mentioned plans. So can we shift a little bit to talking about how to be neuroaffirming when we are creating behavior plans or responding to what we're identifying as problem behavior? And we might need to just talk about that term a little bit. But a big piece of the neuroaffirming movement is viewing these brain-based differences as valuable in and of themselves, as opposed to something to be extinguished. And how do you see that showing up, especially as a BCBA, when you're creating plans for students? Like, what kind of considerations or maybe conversations? I know you've had a lot of difficult conversations with folks about what is a behavior that we need to shape versus what is a behavior that is the student communicating a need versus what is a behavior that is just like, hey, can't you see the value in this? Like, this is not something that we need to extinguish or change. This is just the student showing up as their authentic selves.
So sometimes I think that we forget that students who are neurodivergent have a lot of strengths and we can harness those. It's like harnessing the powers for good, right? And we think of things like right now in the Olympics, there's a ton of social media posts about athletes who are neurodivergent and being very successful. We've seen it in the past with athletes like Michael Phelps, Simone Biles, all speaking out about being neurodivergent or having ADHD or being on medication. And when we look at students who are neurodivergent, a lot of times I hear teachers talk about things like they're fixated, they're black and white thinking, they're hyper-focused, they require a lot of movement. And really, that drive is so amazing. If we can harness that, where they could focus on an interest, a lot of times we say go deeper, not broader, right? We want this deep learning. Like ADHD people and neurodivergent people are the perfect candidates for that. And I can speak to it. So if you're new to the podcast, I am ADHD, I have ADHD myself. I have anxiety and I am a little neurospicy, or as Sarah likes to call me, unhinged. And so I can speak to the fact that when I get hyper-focused, that's where my strength is. If there is something I want to accomplish, and Sarah knows, she'll get my text messages at whatever time. Hey, I've been thinking about this for like 2 days straight, and this is the rabbit hole I've gone down. And so if we can take their interests and incorporate them into the day, we're going to see a lot more success. There's a possibility of backlash on this because how are teachers supposed to manage that in the classroom setting? Okay, we have to teach this curriculum, right? And this kid is focused on space, but I can see where this is difficult to manage and where some people struggle is, okay, their hyper-focus right now is outer space, right? Everything, if I can relate anything to space at all, I will have this kid in the palm of my hand, right? This kid will learn, this kid will do all of the things. But in the classroom, I have to move on and I'm teaching state history now, or we're moving on to a totally different concept, not related to space. How do I still harness that interest of space, continue with what I'm teaching, and meet the needs of all these learners in one room?
Well, and I think there's two different pieces. So there's two different things that immediately popped in my head. The first was UDL. So for kindergartners where they aren't yet maybe creating their own goals and like doing their own projects yet, this is going to be a little bit harder. But this is where people will pull in ideas like, well, can you put space stickers just all over? Can you use imagery of space in your other lessons and do it for the whole class? Don't do it. You don't even have to do it just for that kid. And if you have other kids with fixations, have 2 or 3 different options, but it's those fixations, like that's fine. But for older grades, there's plenty of historical figures who went to space or who had some hand in, like the other piece is then honoring their assent. So honoring their no. So when students say, well, then I'm not doing that, they have just said, I'm not doing that. And yes, it's going to mean difficult conversations with families, but like, I'm not going to sit there and publicly shame them or for having this fixation and not being able to move past it in that moment. Because anything that we're going to put in place right there that isn't accompanied by other more affirming therapies that assist them with the way that they're communicating or thinking about the connection between this math and their goals of space. If we're not doing that, then we're just doing compliance in the classroom in that moment. I'm thinking about that exact moment. You know what I mean?
My worry for my fellow neurodivergents is that gets used against them in a way where they use a fixation to get compliance. So if you do these things, then you can have access to these space materials. Right now, we have a lot of kids that are really fixated on things like number blocks in the primary, or, even in upper grades, we have different things that they really want access to. So we kind of hold that access, those materials hostage. Oh, they want space? Maybe we can get them to work for space. I can guarantee if that is a hyper focus or a hyper fixation, they're not getting the pieces to why, they're not understanding why you're withholding that from them. And that could cause further behavior problems. And so I think, how can we harness it? How can we honor those fixations and if we do that, they will learn more if we're able to incorporate their interests, their fixations. And then, right now I will talk about one student very vaguely, but one student, for example, that comes in and man, that kid just needs to move, right? Like he is very energetic first thing in the morning. And if you take that student out first thing in the morning and you just give that kid space to run, you get a totally different student after that. But then we have some incredible staff who are incorporating more and more movement because that's really what he loves. He loves to move. He needs to move. It's his body. And as they're doing that, I've seen a really staff member kind of like chase him around the classroom in a sense, but not in a bad way. Hear me out. So if they're doing like letters and numbers, as the student is moving around, they're counting things with them.
Yes.
They're incorporating literacy. So the student is going to move whether we like it or not. And the staff has done such a great job at just embracing this movement. Like, how can we give them time to move, get it all out as much as we can? And then when it starts happening again in the room, how can we just honor that? He needs that. But we can also promote literacy, promote number sense while those things are happening. And I know that's a younger grade thing. So if you're listening and you have older students, I know you don't want a high school kid just taking laps around a classroom. But it's just one example of how we can honor that. And you're right about the UDL. I'm thinking about, can we teach a concept using materials we have, but allow a student to have maybe an alternate project with the same academic outcomes, just with different material?
Well, and you asked about the how. How do we do this? What's the mental shift? And I think first we start by just seeing each student as a person, because I think about the adults and I think about like us as a staff. We aren't all doing the same thing all the time. We don't all buy into every single project or like cool new idea or movement that's happening in education. We have our passions too. And as leadership, we're always trying to to harness people's passions as well. So you bring up fixation, and I think this is where it comes into play in real life. And when I have a student who is fixated on outer space, even at 5 years old, I just try to assume that one day this kid is going to go to space. One day this kid's going to be an engineer and part of some program. And so what am I doing to be able to support them towards that goal? And when I reframe things that way, at least in social work and the mental health work that I do with folks, it helps in terms of creating goals. I think another piece that you brought up is how are we incorporating the student themselves in that conversation about, okay, well, what is your goal here? What is it that we're trying to work towards? And if you have a stuck point where you're like, okay, I get it, but I really need to teach this kid math and I haven't figured out how, just bring in the kid, ask the kid, hey, I want to do this. I want to be able to help you learn this. What is it that you're needing? Sometimes kids can't communicate that yet, and that's okay. And that's where you can also pull in your speech paths and other service providers to try to understand, hey, how can I communicate this better? But yeah, that's kind of some of where my mind goes. And I know in the neuroaffirming model, they talk a lot about having epistemic humility, approaching any person with the humility of saying they are the expert in their own experience. And so that's really what I need to tap into is their expertise about how they're living in this world and how they want to see their life moving forward.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of bringing kids into conversations. No matter what age, I'm a fan of kids being in IEP meetings. I think they need to have a voice for sure. And kid that we talked about at the beginning. So say he is refusing and he's like, I'm not doing any of this work. And part of that is also working with the student on ways he can advocate for himself. Hey, when you say no, that you're not doing this work and you tear up your paper, what are you trying to tell us? Are you trying to tell us that you just don't like to write? Are you trying to tell us that this is too hard? Are you trying to what are you wanting us to know? And when I have worked with a kid before who said, I it's just so much. Like I see it and I just freak out. Okay, then that gets us in a whole different place, right? I am not going to write a behavior plan for that student that he will just agree to every piece of work that's put in front of him. What we're going to do is we're going to work on a plan with that student, and it's probably not a behavior plan. It's just helping him advocate for himself. Hey, can we say something? Can we use a help card? Can we say, hey, this is too much. Can I have half of the paper? And as kids get older, that gets more important because they need to go into the real world and know how to advocate for themselves and know how to appropriately express their needs. So when they're younger, when they're in school, we can help them with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing what to consent to and how to express your no. I love I love consent.
Yeah, well, it's so important. And that's probably
Uh-huh.
one of our biggest, I think we've said it the most, is we do not think it's appropriate for kids to learn to follow every adult direction. When I give him an assignment, he needs to do the assignment. When I tell him he needs to do this, he needs to do this. Well, let's talk about that and let's talk about what that looks like. Because we don't want him to learn that. We don't want him to learn to do every single thing you tell this student to do. And that becomes, more and more important as they get older, as they go into the real world, or they're confronted with situations that are harmful situations.
Well, and on that note, I think that helps bring us back full circle to this idea that when we're talking about neuroaffirming practice, we're really talking about a framework for an approach when we're thinking about our systems and how we're building our systems, what it all looks like. Everything from kind of big picture to all the way down to how am I structuring my SDI? How am I doing my FBAs? All the things. And so I have no doubt, Jessica, that this idea of neuroaffirming practice is going to come up in future episodes. And we just wanted to give folks a little taste of that today, a little bit of a primer on what it looks like. But we'll definitely be talking about this more, I think, in the future. And so with that, thank you all for listening. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and follow us on social media. We are at Strong Starts Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Bye, everybody.